When the millionaire's bride ran away on the wedding day, he asked the maid to replace her at the altar. What started as a disaster ended as a fairy tale. The hall of St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, was decorated with hundreds of white orchids and a red carpet that stretched to the altar. The guests, members of local high society, whispered among themselves while Sire Callahan stood motionless before the priest, his impeccable tuxedo contrasting with the pallor of his face. 15 minutes had passed since the appointed time for the ceremony, and Madison Sinclair, his fiancée, had still not arrived. "Mr. Callahan," whispered the priest, leaning in discreetly. "Perhaps we should." Sawyer's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. His hands shook slightly as he read the message. "I'm sorry. I can't do that. Bye." The buzz increased as Sawyer staggered towards one of the church pews. Humiliation burned in his chest as he saw the pitying looks and mischievous smiles of the 300 guests present. Among them were important executives, local politicians, and practically all of Newport's elite. It was then that his eyes met Lila Bennett, his housekeeper for the past 3 years, standing discreetly near the side entrance to the ballroom. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress, appropriate for an employee attending a formal event, and her gaze conveyed a genuine compassion that contrasted with the falsely pitying expressions around her. In a moment of complete desperation and perhaps madness, Sawyer stood up and walked towards her. "Lila," he said quietly, "marry me." Her brown eyes widened. "Mr. Callahan, you're not thinking clearly." "Please," he insisted, holding her hands. "I can't bear the thought of leaving here like the man who was abandoned at the altar. You're the most loyal person I know." Lila felt the weight of the prying eyes on them. She knew Sawyer well enough to know that, behind the facade of the successful 32-year-old businessman, there was a man who carried deep insecurities ever since his mother abandoned them when he was a child. "Yes," she replied, surprising herself. The murmur in the hall turned into an uproar when Sawyer announced that the wedding would take place, but with a different bride. Some people left the church, shocked by what they considered a scandal, while others stayed, too fascinated by the turn of events to leave. During the impromptu ceremony, Lila was trying to process the madness of the moment. At 28, she had never imagined that she would marry her boss, the man who barely noticed her beyond her domestic duties at the seaside mansion. After the ceremony, during the reception that took place on the Callahan estate, Lila watched the remaining guests with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. Madison's wedding dress, which one of the bridesmaids had brought from the bride's room, had been hastily adjusted and looked great on her slender body. "You saved my reputation today," Sawyer said, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. "I know this is crazy, but I promise I'll make it up to you." "What happens now?" Lila asked, accepting the glass. "We can keep up appearances for a while," he suggested. "Then, when the scandal dies down, we can divorce discreetly." Something in Lila's chest tightened at those words, although she couldn't explain why. "Of course," she replied. "It makes sense." Over the next few weeks, life at the Callahan mansion turned into a strange theater. Lila moved into the master bedroom, while Sawyer occupied one of the guest rooms. During the day, she continued to manage the house and the staff, but in the evenings, she had to play the part of a passionate wife at social events. To her surprise, Sawyer turned out to be different from the distant boss she knew. In their nightly conversations in the library, she discovered a complex man who hid his vulnerability under layers of professional success and social arrogance. "I never knew you were so well versed in classic literature," he remarked one evening when he found her reading Jane Austen. "There's a lot about me you don't know," she replied, allowing herself a small smile. "I studied literature at Brown University before financial problems forced me to drop out." Sawyer's gaze changed subtly that night, as if he was really seeing Lila for the first time. However, external pressure began to mount. Madison's mother started a smear campaign against Lila on social media, accusing her of being an opportunist who had planned the whole thing. "Don't let them get to you," Sawyer said, finding her crying in the garden after a particularly unpleasant event. "You're much better than all of them." "Why?" she asked, wiping away her tears. "Because I'm your maid who accepted an absurd deal?" "No," he replied, his tone surprisingly soft. Because you're the only person in this world who has ever shown me true kindness without expecting anything in return." Those words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was ready to explore. What had begun as a desperate agreement was turning into something deeper and more frightening. As she watched the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean from the balcony of the mansion, Lila wondered if she had made a mistake in accepting that crazy proposal. Not because of the scandal or the nasty comments, but because, for the first time in her life, she was beginning to feel something real for a man who only saw her as part of a convenient arrangement. Fate had a peculiar sense of humor, she thought. In her wildest fantasies, she had never imagined that a sham marriage could awaken such true feelings. The first rays of sunlight found Lila already awake in her new bedroom, surrounded by the luxury she had never imagined calling her own. The French silk curtains and Egyptian sheets were a constant reminder of how drastically her life had changed in just a few weeks. As she prepared for another day, she reflected on how she would maintain her work routine now that she also bore the Callahan surname. "The staff arrive in an hour," Sawyer commented, meeting her in the kitchen. He looked impeccable in his navy blue suit, but the dark circles under his eyes were indicative of a bad night's sleep. "Maybe we should rethink a few things." "Like what?" Lila asked, pouring coffee into 2 cups, a habit she had developed over the last few days. "It doesn't seem appropriate for my wife to continue managing the household staff," he explained, accepting the cup. "I've hired a new housekeeper. Margaret Williams will start today." Lila felt a tightness in her chest. Her job was more than just a job. It was her identity, her independence. "And what do you suggest I do all day?" "Well, executives' wives usually get involved in charity work, go to clubs." Sawyer stopped when he saw the look on her face. "Sorry, that sounded condescending," Lila added, putting her cup in the sink with more force than necessary. "Sawyer, I can't pretend to be something I'm not." "I'm not asking you to," he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "But we need to make it look real. The company board has been watching my every move since that incident." The mention of the failed marriage to Madison hung heavily between them. Lila knew that Sawyer's reputation was at stake, and part of her, a part that grew every day, wanted to protect him. "I have a proposal," she said after a moment's thought. "I can take on the coordination of the restoration project for the Newport Public Library. It's a meaningful job, and one that suits my background in literature." Sawyer's face lit up with genuine interest. "Do you really want to do that?" "Yes. It would be a way to use my education and help the community without having to transform myself into something I'm not." That afternoon, Lila visited the public library, a majestic Victorian building in dire need of renovation. The director, Dr. Harrison, was visibly surprised to discover that the new Mrs. Callahan had in-depth knowledge of literature and project management. "Your wife is extraordinary," he commented when Sawyer showed up at the end of the day to pick her up. "She's already developed a complete plan for the digitization of the rare collection." Sawyer watched Lila animatedly explaining her plans, her brown eyes shining with enthusiasm. It was a side of her he had never seen before, and something inside him moved. On the way home, the silence in the car was different from before, more comfortable, almost complicit. "You surprise me every day," Sawyer admitted. "Because you've never bothered to get to know me before," she replied, without rancor in her voice. That evening, during a charity dinner at the Newport Country Club, Lila faced her first major social test. Wearing an elegant emerald green dress, chosen by herself, not some fashion consultant, she navigated the conversations with a natural grace that surprised even the most skeptical. "So, darling," a local society lady asked with false sweetness, "how exactly did you win over our dear Sawyer so quickly?" Before Lila could answer, Sawyer appeared at her side, slipping a protective arm around her waist. "Actually, I had to win her over," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lila refused my invitations 3 times before accepting a coffee." The impromptu lie was so natural that for a moment even Lila almost believed it. She felt the warmth of his hand on her waist and realized how perfectly their bodies fit together. Later, in the mansion's library, her usual nighttime refuge, Lila found Sawyer gazing into the burning fireplace. "Thank you for standing up for me today," she said, sitting down next to him. "I was just telling the truth," he replied distractedly. "You're the kind of person who would need to be won over. And you're the kind of person who's used to getting everything easily," she observed. Sawyer turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the flames. "Not everything. In fact, lately I've been realizing that the most valuable things are those that require effort to understand." The weight of those words hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Lila realized that they were treading a dangerous path, where the line between pretense and reality was beginning to blur. "Good night, Sawyer," she said softly, getting up. "Good night, Lila," he replied, his gaze following her until she disappeared through the door. That night, in separate rooms of the same mansion, they both lay awake, contemplating how an agreement of convenience was slowly turning into something neither of them had planned or was prepared to face. The news of Sawyer Callahan's impromptu marriage to his housekeeper had spread far beyond Newport, reaching the national tabloids. Lila found this out in the most unpleasant way possible when, during her weekly visit to the local market, she saw her face splashed across the front page of a gossip magazine with the headline, "From Apron to Altar, Newport's Modern Cinderella." "Don't pay any attention to that," said Caroline. The florist who had always treated her kindly, even before her sudden marriage. Petty people always need to create stories to make themselves feel better. But it wasn't just the press that was interested in the unlikely couple. The next morning, Sawyer received a phone call that would change the dynamics of his deal. "My grandmother is coming to Newport," he announced over breakfast, his voice tense. "Eleanor Callahan won't take no for an answer." Lila almost choked on her tea. Eleanor Callahan was a legendary figure in New England society, known as much for her philanthropy as for her ruthless judgment. "When?" "Tomorrow," Sawyer replied, loosening his tie. "And she intends to stay for 2 weeks." Lila's initial panic was replaced by calm determination. "Well, then we'll have to be more convincing than ever." "Lila," Sawyer hesitated, "my grandmother has a special talent for detecting lies. She practically created an empire by discovering people's true intentions." That night, they rehearsed their fabricated love story in the library. How they really met, when they realized their feelings, their first kiss. Every detail needed to seem genuine. "Our first date was right here," Lila suggested, gesturing to the library. "You found me reading Pride and Prejudice after work. And I was intrigued to see my housekeeper so engrossed in a classic," Sawyer added, a genuine smile appearing on his lips. Actually, that wouldn't be a complete lie. Eleanor's arrival the following morning turned the mansion into a whirlwind of activity. At 78, she still retained the elegant posture and discerning eye that had made her one of Boston's most respected women. "So," Eleanor said over lunch, her blue eyes studying Lila with intensity, "tell me how my grandson finally found someone who made him forget that Sinclair girl." Lila felt Sawyer's hand squeeze hers under the table. "Actually, Mrs. Callahan, it was a gradual process. Sawyer and I really got to know each other through books." "Literature?" Eleanor arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "Yes," Sawyer interjected. "Lila has an impressive knowledge of classical literature. She's currently coordinating the restoration of the public library." "Interesting," Eleanor murmured, but her tone suggested that she was far from convinced. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. During the day, Lila continued her work at the public library, now with the added weight of Eleanor's prying eyes. At night, she and Sawyer had to keep up the facade of being a couple in love. However, something strange began to happen. The casual touches, the glances exchanged over dinner, the late-night conversations in the library. Everything began to seem less rehearsed and more natural. "You're terrible actors," Eleanor declared one evening, meeting them on the balcony. "But maybe that's exactly why I believe in you." "What do you mean?" Lila asked, her heart racing. "Darling, couples who pretend to be in love often exaggerate. You too. There's a tension in the air, an electricity that can't be manufactured. You're so busy trying to pretend you're not in love that you don't realize you already are." Eleanor's words hung in the air like autumn leaves, delicate but impossible to ignore. Sawyer and Lila looked at each other, unable to deny or confirm the observation. Later that evening, as they walked along the beach near the mansion, the The silence between them was laden with unspoken possibilities. "My grandmother was always very observant," Sawyer finally said, his voice almost lost in the sound of the waves. "She could also be wrong," Lila replied, although her heart protested against her own words. "She might," he agreed, stopping to stare at her. The moonlight reflected in his eyes, revealing a vulnerability she rarely saw. "But what if she isn't?" Before Lila could answer, Sawyer's cell phone rang. It was his assistant, informing him that Madison Sinclair had returned to Newport and was requesting a meeting. The magical moment crumbled like a sandcastle hit by the tide. Lila felt her heart squeeze, painfully reminded that her marriage was only a temporary arrangement. "You should find her," she said, her voice betraying more emotion than she had intended. "Maybe she wants to explain herself." "Lila, it's all right, Sawyer. This is what we've been waiting for, isn't it? A chance to end this deal cleanly." But as she walked back to the mansion alone, Lila realized that nothing about the situation was clean or simple. Somewhere between the lies and the truths, her heart had decided to ignore all the rules she herself had set. The law firm Peterson and Associates occupied the entire 10th floor of a modernist building in downtown Newport. Sawyer watched the city through the panoramic windows while Madison Sinclair, sitting on the other side of the meeting table, explained her reasons for leaving him at the altar. "It was a moment of clarity," she said, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming on the mahogany table. "I realized that we were getting married for the wrong reasons. Family expectations, company mergers, social pressure." Sawyer kept his expression neutral, but inside, a storm of emotions was consuming him. "And you couldn't have realized that before I was standing in front of the altar?" "I'm sorry," Madison whispered, her blue eyes misty, "but now I realize I made a mistake. We can try again. Do it right this time." The proposal hung in the air like toxic smoke. A few weeks ago, Sawyer would have considered it. Now, however, the image of Lila walking alone on the beach the night before kept running through his mind. "There's no again, Madison," he replied, standing up. "Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." Meanwhile, in the public library, Lila immersed herself in her restoration work, trying to ignore the fact that, at that very moment, her lying husband was reuniting with his ex-fiancée. Dr. Harrison noticed her distraction when she mistakenly cataloged a first edition of The Hill of the Howling Winds. "You know," he commented, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses, "sometimes the most valuable books are those that seem ordinary at first glance. You have to look beyond the cover to discover their true value." Lila smiled faintly, recognizing the metaphor. Some people prefer shiny covers and flashy titles, and others discover that the real story lies in the pages stained by time and use, Eleanor Callahan interrupted, emerging from among the old bookshelves. "Can we talk, dear?" Lila followed her grandmother, by law, into the library garden, a small green oasis in the heart of the city. Eleanor sat down on a stone bench, motioning for Lila to do the same. "You're in love with my grandson," Eleanor declared without preamble. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Callahan, Eleanor, please. And don't try to deny it. I see how you look at him when you think no one is watching." Lila felt her defenses crumble. That wasn't in the plans. "Love rarely is," Eleanor smiled softly. "You know, I've watched you these last few days. You're not just intelligent and capable, you're genuine. Something rare in our social circle. But not good enough for someone like Sawyer," Lila added bitterly. "On the contrary," Eleanor took her hand. "You're exactly what he needs. But the question is, are you willing to fight for it?" Before Lila could reply, her phone vibrated with a message from Sawyer. "We need to talk. Dinner at 8? The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. When Lila arrived at the mansion, she found the dining room decorated with candles and her favorite flowers, white peonies. "Madison wants to get back together," Sawyer announced without preamble as soon as she sat down. Lila's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. "I see," she managed to say. "I suppose that simplifies things. We can announce our separation and—" "I refused," Sawyer interrupted her, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because I realized something today, during that meeting. While she was talking about starting over, all I could think about was you." "Sawyer," Let me finish, he asked, getting up to approach her. When we got married, it was out of desperation and convenience. But something changed. You changed everything, Lila. The way I see the world, the way I see myself. That's just gratitude, she protested weakly, even though her heart was screaming the opposite. No, it's more than that. He took her hands. It's the way you laugh when you're truly happy, how your eyes sparkle when you talk about literature, how you care about everyone around you without expecting anything in return. Tears began to stream down Lila's face. I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid that one day you'll wake up and realize that you'd prefer someone better suited to your world. My world was empty before you, Sawyer declared, drying her tears with his thumb. And I don't want to go back to that life of appearances and empty expectations. But society? To hell with society, he smiled. My grandmother already told me that if I let you get away, she'll disown me. Lila couldn't help but laugh through her tears. She said something similar to me today. So, Sawyer knelt down in front of her. Lila Bennett Callahan, will you marry me? This time for love, not convenience. The moment was interrupted by the sound of applause. Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the dining room, a satisfied smile on her face. Finally, now we can plan a real wedding. I haven't heard your answer yet, Sawyer whispered to Lila. She pulled him into a kiss, their first real kiss, full of promise and possibility. Yes, she murmured against his lips. 1,000 times yes. Eleanor discreetly withdrew, leaving the young couple in their moment of discovery. Sometimes, she reflected, fate had peculiar ways of righting the wrongs of the past and bringing the right people together, even if through the most unlikely of paths. The news of Sawyer Callahan's second marriage proposal, this time genuine, spread through Newport like fire through dry straw. However, not everyone received the news with the same approval as Eleanor. The Sinclair family, in particular, were determined not to let their revenge go unnoticed. Have you seen this? Lila asked, showing Sawyer her tablet during breakfast. On the screen, an article from the Newport Daily News questioned the legitimacy of their marriage, suggesting an investigation into possible marriage fraud. Regina Sinclair's work, no doubt, Sawyer replied, his jaw tense. Madison's mother has always been an expert at destroying reputations. What if they find out the truth about how we got started? Lila asked, her teacup trembling slightly in her hands. It doesn't matter how we started, he replied, covering her hand with his. What matters is where we are now. However, the external pressure began to mount. That afternoon, during a Callahan Enterprises board meeting, one of the older shareholders, Howard Bennett, no relation to Lila, raised concerns about the stability of Sawyer's leadership. First a failed marriage, then a hasty union with a maid, Howard argued. Investors are nervous, Sawyer. We need guarantees. My personal life doesn't affect my ability to lead this company, Sawyer replied firmly. Last quarter's figures prove that. Meanwhile, at the public library, Lila was facing her own challenges. One of Madison's old friends, Charlotte Pierce, showed up during her meeting with potential donors for the restoration project. It's fascinating how some people manage to climb the social ladder so quickly, Charlotte remarked aloud, interrupting Lila's presentation. Almost like a modern fairy tale, isn't it? Dr. Harrison, sensing the venom in Charlotte's words, intervened. Ms. Callahan has demonstrated exceptional competence in this project. Her academic training and dedication are exemplary. Incomplete education, Charlotte corrected with a mischievous smile. You dropped out of Brown University, didn't you? For financial reasons, Lila replied calmly, although her heart was racing. And I intend to resume my studies next semester. The news took everyone by surprise, including Sawyer himself, who had arrived silently during the confrontation. And you have my full support in that, he declared, walking over to Lila and kissing her forehead softly. Later, in the privacy of his home office, Sawyer confronted Lila about her decision. Why didn't you tell me about your plans to go back to university? Because I was still processing the idea, she admitted. After Eleanor mentioned your connections with Brown, I started to consider the possibility, but I didn't want people to think I was using our marriage for my own benefit. You're my wife, Sawyer emphasized, pulling her closer. Your success is our success. The moment was interrupted by an urgent call from Eleanor. The Callahan matriarch had discovered something disturbing about Madison. "She's pregnant," Eleanor announced bluntly when she arrived at the mansion an hour later. "And she's claiming the baby is yours, Sawyer." The silence that followed was deafening. Lila felt the ground disappear beneath her feet as Sawyer visibly paled. "That's impossible," he finally said. "Madison and I haven't. Not in the last 6 months at least." "Well, she's telling a different story to anyone who will listen," Eleanor replied. "And Regina Sinclair is already planning a press conference." Lila watched the emotions cross Sawyer's face. Shock, anger, then determination. "I'll sort it out," he promised, holding Lila's hand tightly. "No," Lila said softly. "We'll sort it out. Together." Eleanor watched the couple approvingly. "You two have grown up a lot since that impromptu wedding, and maybe that's exactly why certain people are so determined to break you up." That night, as a storm brewed over Newport, Sawyer and Lila stayed awake in the library, their refuge since the beginning. The rain beat against the windows as they planned their next steps. "I'm not going to let them destroy what we've built," Sawyer declared, his fingers intertwined with Lila's. "Even if it means facing your entire social circle?" she asked. "Especially so," he smiled. "You know, when Madison left me at the altar, I thought my life was over. Now I realize it was just the beginning of something real, something true." The words hung in the air like promises, stronger than the thunder that echoed outside. What had begun as an agreement of convenience had turned into an emotional fortress that not even the fiercest storms could shake. Eleanor, watching the couple discreetly from the library door, smiled to herself. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest love stories are born out of the most unlikely situations. And while the storm roared outside, inside the Callahan mansion, two hearts found shelter in each other, proving that true love was undaunted by scandal or social threats. The press conference called by Regina Sinclair took place in the main hall of the Newport Harbor Hotel, a historic establishment that had witnessed countless dramas of local high society. The room was packed with journalists and members of the social elite, all eagerly awaiting what promised to be the scandal of the year. Moments before the start, Sawyer and Lila stood in an adjacent room, preparing for what was to come. Eleanor had hired Martin Walsh, the best defamation lawyer on the East Coast, who was now reviewing his strategy with the couple. "We have concrete evidence that Ms. Sinclair was in Europe during the period in which she claims to have conceived," Martin explained, showing travel records on his tablet. "More specifically, at an exclusive spa in Switzerland." "Why would she do that?" Lila asked, her voice betraying concern. "There must be something more." "There's always something more," Eleanor intervened, entering the room with a folder in hand. "And I've just found out exactly what it is." The Callahan matriarch revealed that Sinclair Industries, Madison's family business, was on the verge of bankruptcy. A marriage to Sawyer would have guaranteed not only social status, but also a business merger that would have saved the dwindling empire. "They're desperate," Eleanor concluded. "And desperate people make mistakes." Sawyer observed Lila, who remained calm despite the approaching storm. Her navy blue dress, carefully chosen for the occasion, reflected a discreet elegance that contrasted with the sensationalism of the moment. "You don't have to go through this," he whispered, holding her hand. "I can face them alone." "No," Lila replied firmly. "We're a team now. For better or worse, remember?" When Regina Sinclair stepped up to the podium, with Madison at her side showing off a small bulge under her designer dress, silence overtook the hall. However, before she could begin her rehearsed speech, Eleanor Callahan took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor's voice echoed through the hall, "before this farce continues, I would like to present some interesting facts about Miss Sinclair and her supposed pregnancy." What followed was a meticulous presentation of evidence, travel records, medical documents from the Swiss spa, and, the final blow, an audio recording where Madison discussed her plan with an accomplice. "That's defamation," Regina shouted, her face red with fury. "We'll sue all of you." "Please do," Martin Walsh replied calmly. "It will be a pleasure to present all this evidence in court." Madison, seeing her plan fall apart, dropped her victim mask. "You've ruined everything," she accused Lila. "It was supposed to be my happy ending." "Happy endings have to be earned, not manipulated," Lila replied, her voice soft but firm. "And they usually don't come the way we expect." The press conference turned into a media circus, with journalists rushing to publish the real story. Not about a housekeeper who stole a groom, but about a former bride who tried to destroy a legitimate marriage out of financial desperation. Later that evening, in the privacy of the Callahan Mansion's library, Sawyer found Lila gazing into the fireplace. The fire danced in her eyes, reflecting the inner strength he had learned to admire. "You were amazing today," he said, taking a seat next to her. "You kept your dignity even when they tried to destroy it." "I've learned a lot about dignity over the years," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "When you have to work to survive, you learn that your true strength comes from within. And that's why I love you," Sawyer declared, the words coming out naturally for the first time. "Not just for who you are, but for making me want to be better." Lila turned to face him, surprised by the spontaneous declaration. "Do you really mean that?" "Every word," he smiled, touching her cheek gently. "What started out as a desperate deal showed me what true love is." Eleanor, who was passing in the corridor, smiled as she heard the conversation. Her plan had worked perfectly, not only in exposing the truth about Madison, but in further strengthening the bond between her grandson and Lila. "I think now we can finally plan that vow renewal," she commented, entering the library. "Something small, intimate, only with people who really matter. No 300 guests this time?" Sawyer joked, remembering his first failed wedding. "No," Lila smiled, "just real family." The word family echoed in everyone's heart. For Lila, who had lost her parents early, for Sawyer, who had always sought approval in superficial relationships, and for Eleanor, who saw in her new granddaughter the daughter she never had. The crisis had passed, but its consequences brought more than just vindication. It brought growth, unity, and the certainty that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as challenges. The next morning, as Newport woke up for another day, the Callahan Mansion breathed new energy. The scandal had turned into triumph, and what had begun as a necessary lie had blossomed into the purest truth. The scandal involving Madison had dissipated like mist under the morning sun, but its repercussions still echoed through the corridors of Newport's high society. For Sawyer and Lila, however, the moment brought unexpected clarity about their relationship and their future. One Thursday morning, Lila found a letter on her desk in the public library, a reply from Brown University about her application for readmission. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope, her heart racing as she read the first few lines. "Accepted," she exclaimed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I never doubted it," Dr. Harrison smiled, watching her reaction. "You were always destined for something greater than cataloging old books." That evening, Sawyer organized a small celebration at the mansion. Eleanor, Dr. Harrison, and a few close friends gathered in the winter garden, where soft lights danced among the tropical flowers that Lila loved so much. "A toast to our future literature graduate," Sawyer proposed, raising his glass. "And to the courage to start again," Eleanor added, her proud gaze fixed on Lila. As the guests chatted, Sawyer pulled Lila into a more private corner of the garden. "I have a surprise for you," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside, Lila found the deed to a small bookstore in the historic center of Newport. "Sawyer, what's this?" "Your next chapter," he smiled. "The former owner is retiring and wanted someone who really loved books to continue her legacy. I thought it could be your side project while you finish your studies. But how am I going to run a bookshop, study and be my wife?" he added softly. "The same way you do everything else, with grace, determination, and that intelligence that made me fall in love with you." The moment was interrupted by Caroline, the florist, who arrived late to the celebration with disturbing news. "Lila, you need to see this," she said, showing her phone. It was a post on a local gossip blog, suggesting that Lila had manipulated her admission to Brown using the Callahan's influence. The text, although anonymous, bore clear hallmarks of Regina Sinclair's venomous style. "Ignore it," Eleanor intervened, sensing the growing tension. Petty people will always try to diminish someone else's success. No, Lila replied, a new determination in her voice. No more ignoring. It's time to show who I really am. Over the next few days, Lila immersed herself in her bookshop project, transforming the vintage space into something unique. She kept the old wooden shelves and plank flooring, but added modern elements, a literary cafe on the mezzanine, spaces for book clubs, and a special section dedicated to local authors. You're creating more than a bookstore, observed Dr. Harrison during a visit. You're building a sanctuary for lovers of literature. The grand opening of Bennett and Books coincided with the start of classes at Brown. Lila divided her time between Newport and Providence, balancing studies, business, and her life with Sawyer with a determination that impressed everyone. How do you do it? Asked a classmate, Amanda, after a particularly intense Victorian literature class. I've learned that when you truly love something or someone, you find strength you didn't even know you had, Lila replied, thinking about how her life had changed in the last year. At home, her relationship with Sawyer continued to evolve. Evenings in the library, once a refuge from their artificial arrangement, were now moments of genuine connection. They discussed literature, business, and dreams, building a partnership that transcended their unlikely origins. You know what I love most about you? Sawyer remarked one evening, while Lila was sharing her ideas for an essay on Jane Austen. How you've never lost your essence, even with all the changes in your life. Maybe because I finally found people who love me exactly as I am, she replied, leaning back against his chest. The news that Regina Sinclair had left Newport for a season of rest in Europe came as a whisper through social circles. Madison, according to close sources, had started therapy and began working for an NGO that supports women in vulnerable situations. People can surprise us, Eleanor commented during a family dinner. Sometimes we need to fall to learn how to get up. How did you know? Lila asked suddenly. Right from the start, you seemed to see something in us that even we didn't see. Eleanor smiled, that wise smile that bore decades of observation of human nature. Because I saw two lonely hearts finding each other, even through unusual circumstances. True love doesn't follow pre-established scripts. That evening, after Eleanor had left, Sawyer found Lila on the balcony, gazing out at the lights of Newport Harbor. What are you thinking about? How unpredictable life is, she replied, entwining her fingers in his. A year ago, I was your housekeeper, trying to scrape together the money to go back to university. Now you're my wife, a businesswoman and future literature graduate, he added. And I couldn't be prouder or more in love. The gentle ocean wind carried promises of the future, while the stars silently witnessed another chapter in this unlikely love story. A story that proved that sometimes the best romances are those that life writes when we're not paying attention. Bennett and Books had become one of Newport's most beloved spots in just a few months. One autumn afternoon, as the sun filtered through the bookshop's Victorian windows, Lila was organizing a book signing with a local novelist when she noticed something unusual. Regina Sinclair standing discreetly among the historical fiction shelves. The two women stared at each other for a tense moment, until Regina took a hesitant step towards her. "May I speak to you?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual arrogance. In private, Lila led Regina up to the mezzanine office, a cozy space decorated with black and white photographs of classic writers. "What can I do for you?" she asked, maintaining a professional tone. "I came to apologize," Regina said, surprising Lila. "My therapy in Zurich made me realize how much harm I'd caused by trying to protect Madison and our social status." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you built something real here," Regina gestured to the bookstore below. "While we were trying to destroy your reputation, you created a place that really contributes to the community." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sawyer, who had dropped by to pick up Lila for an important appointment, her first presentation as a guest speaker at Brown, where she would be talking about the importance of literary spaces in the digital age. "Regina," he greeted coldly, positioning himself protectively next to Lila. "I was just leaving," Regina replied, getting up. At the door, she stopped and turned around. "You two proved me wrong about everything. You have something, Madison, and you never had, Sawyer. Something real." After she left, Lila noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" Sawyer asked, hugging her. "I am," she replied, taking a deep breath. "It's strange, but I feel like a difficult chapter is finally closing." In Brown's auditorium, Lila faced her largest audience yet. Among teachers and students, more than 200 people were waiting for her words on the role of independent bookstores in the cultural formation of communities. "Books are not just stories printed on paper," she began, her voice gaining confidence. "They are bridges between people, between experiences, between worlds. A bookstore doesn't just sell books, it offers possibilities." From the front row, Sawyer and Eleanor looked on with pride. Next to them, Dr. Harrison smiled like a proud father watching his protege shine. "It's fascinating," Eleanor commented softly, "how she manages to balance everything. Her studies, the bookstore, our social life. And she still finds time to plan our vow renewal," Sawyer added, touching the ring on her finger. The vow renewal ceremony was scheduled for next month. This time planned with care and love, not desperation and convenience. It would take place in the garden of Bennett and Bucks, transformed into a magical space for the occasion. After the talk, during the reception, a young student approached Lila. "Your story inspired me," she said, "knowing that we can start again, that we're not bound by other people's expectations." "Sometimes," Lila replied, "our greatest moments of growth come when we dare to be authentic, even if the world expects something different from us." Back at the Callahan mansion, Lila found a surprise waiting in her room. A first edition of Jane Austen's Persuasion, her favorite book. "I found it at an auction in Boston," Sawyer explained, watching her emotional reaction. "I thought it would be perfect for your special collection in the bookstore." "It is perfect," she whispered, caressing the old cover reverently. "Just like us." That evening, as they prepared the last details for the renewal of vows, Lila reflected on how her life had changed. The housekeeper who once organized social events was now a respected businesswoman and a promising student. "What are you thinking about?" Sawyer asked, finding her in the library. "About how sometimes the happiest endings begin with the most unlikely moments," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "If Madison hadn't run away that day, then I would never have discovered that the perfect woman for me was right under my nose all along," he added, kissing her forehead. Eleanor, who was passing in the corridor, smiled as she overheard the conversation. Her grandson and Lila had proved that true love knew no social barriers or imposed expectations. They had rewritten their own story, page by page, chapter by chapter. "Do you know what I love most about you?" Sawyer asked softly. "How you never tried to fit into the mold that society expected. You simply were yourself, and in the process, taught me to be myself too." "That's because I've learned that our story doesn't have to follow a predefined script," Lila replied. "Sometimes the best novels are the ones we write in our own way." The morning of the vow renewal dawned with a golden glow typical of Newport in the fall. Lila watched as the Bennett and Books garden was transformed into a fairy tale setting, with garlands of white flowers entwined in the bookcases that had been carefully moved to create a natural aisle to the makeshift altar. "Everything is perfect," Eleanor commented, adjusting an arrangement of peonies. "Much more meaningful than that first church wedding." Lila smiled, remembering how her life had changed since that chaotic day. Now, instead of a hastily borrowed dress, she would wear a model designed especially for her. Simple, elegant, and with hidden pockets where she would keep her favorite quotes from romantic literature. "I have something for you," Eleanor said, handing over a small blue velvet box. Inside, a delicate sapphire brooch in the shape of an open book glowed softly. "It was my grandmother's. She was a book lover too." "Eleanor, I can't." "Yes, you can," the matriarch insisted, pinning the brooch to Lila's dress. "You've brought back to our family something we thought we'd lost: authenticity." The ceremony was scheduled for dusk, when the soft lights of vintage lanterns would illuminate the garden. The guests, an intimate selection of true friends and family, began to arrive, many carrying books instead of traditional gifts, fulfilling the couple's special request to contribute to a new section of the bookstore dedicated to love in all its forms. Dr. Harrison, who was to be the celebrant for the ceremony, found Lila in his office on the mezzanine. "Nervous?" "Curiously, no," she replied, adjusting her brooch. "This time, I know exactly where my heart is." On the other side of the bookstore, Sawyer was waiting with a surprise of his own. For months, he had been secretly working on a special project, a handmade book telling their story, illustrated with photographs, notes, and moments captured along their journey. "It's more than a gift," he explained to Caroline, who had helped him bind the volume. "It's a testament to how love can flourish in the most unexpected places." Soft music began to play, an acoustic version of an old love song, as the guests settled among the bookshelves. The scent of old books mingled with the perfume of flowers, creating a unique and intimately personal atmosphere. As Lila began her walk down the aisle of books, each step took her past titles that had marked her life. From the classics that had comforted her in difficult times to the contemporary novels that had inspired her own love story. A year ago, Sawyer began his vows, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I was living through a tragedy, but you, Lila, have transformed my story into something much deeper and truer than any novel I've ever read." Lila, holding a small notebook in which she had written her own vows, took a deep breath. "They say the best books are the ones that surprise you on every page. Our story began as a desperate arrangement, but it turned into the most beautiful romance I could have imagined." Dr. Harrison, visibly moved, led the ceremony with words about how love, like great books, has the power to transform lives. When the time came to exchange rings, new ones, this time, chosen together, the setting sun cast a golden glow through the windows of the bookstore. During the intimate reception, guests were invited to share their own love stories, creating a mosaic of narratives that celebrated the power of genuine connections. Regina Sinclair, standing discreetly at the back of the room, watched it all with a mixture of regret and admiration. "Sometimes," she commented softly to Eleanor, "you have to lose something to understand its true value." Eleanor nodded sagely. "The important thing is to learn from history and write a new chapter." Later, as soft music lulled the last moments of the celebration, Sawyer found Lila among the poetry shelves, absent-mindedly leafing through a volume of Pablo Neruda. "I found you," he smiled, handing her the book he had prepared. Lila carefully opened the leather cover, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized moments from their history together captured in photographs and words. The last page, still blank, bore just one title: Future Chapters. "Because our story is far from over," Sawyer explained, gently kissing her forehead. The sound of clinking glasses drew his attention back to the party, where Eleanor was preparing a toast. "To Lila and Sawyer," she raised her glass, "who reminded us that the best novels are those written from the heart, not from social expectations." As the guests applauded, Lila and Sawyer shared a look that said more than words. There, surrounded by books that told thousands of love stories, they were living their own tale. Not one of princes and princesses, but of two people who found the courage to be authentic with each other. The evening progressed, and the lanterns in the garden created dancing shadows between the bookshelves. Bennett and Books, a silent witness to their journey, seemed to embrace everyone present with its welcoming atmosphere, reminding us that sometimes the most magical places are those where we can simply be who we are. A year after renewing their vows, Bennett and Books had expanded to include a new annex dedicated to literary events and creative writing workshops. Lila, now a literature graduate from Brown, balanced her time between running the bookstore in an ambitious project, writing her own story. "It's strange to put your life into words," she commented to Sawyer one evening, while going over her notes in the mansion's library. "How do you capture on pages something that has so profoundly changed who you are?" "Maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told," he replied, gently massaging her tense shoulders, "to show that sometimes the best novels are the ones that life writes for us." The news that arrived that morning, however, threatened to shatter the peace they had built up. Callahan Enterprises was facing a hostile takeover attempt by a Seattle conglomerate, and the shareholders were pressuring Sawyer to sell. "They say I'm too sentimental to lead the company," Sawyer confessed over a private dinner with Lila and Eleanor, "that my recent decisions favor people over profits. And they're wrong?" Eleanor questioned, arching an eyebrow. Since you started prioritizing employee well-being and sustainable projects, satisfaction and productivity levels have increased significantly. Lila watched her husband with concern. In recent months, Sawyer had implemented several changes in the company: daycare for employees, continuing education programs, environmental initiatives, changes that reflected the man he had become. More compassionate, more aware. Maybe it's time to show them that empathy and success aren't mutually exclusive, Lila suggested, an idea forming in her mind. Over the next few weeks, while Sawyer struggled to maintain control of the company, Lila worked discreetly on a side project. With the help of Dr. Harrison and a team of researchers from Brown, she began documenting the impact of Sawyer's humane policies not only on the company's numbers, but on people's lives. The presentation to the board took place on a rainy spring afternoon. Sawyer, surprised by his wife's presence, watched in awe as she led a masterful presentation on how the changes implemented had not only improved the quality of life for employees, but also increased the company's long-term profitability. The true value of a company can't just be measured in dollars, Lila concluded, her voice firm in front of the veteran executives. It's in the impact it has on the community, the families it supports, the dreams it allows to come true. The silence that followed was broken by applause, initiated, surprisingly, by Howard Bennett, the same shareholder who had previously questioned Sawyer's leadership. Perhaps, Howard admitted, we have underestimated the power of a more human approach to business. The takeover attempt was unanimously rejected by the board, and Sawyer's policies not only maintained, but expanded. The story quickly spread throughout the corporate world, attracting national attention to a new management model that balanced profit and purpose. At home, celebrating the victory with a special bottle of wine kept by Eleanor, Sawyer found Lila in her favorite place, the library. How do you always know exactly what to do? He asked, amazed. Because I learned from books that the best stories are those where the characters find strength in their vulnerabilities, she smiled. And you taught me that sometimes we need to fight for what we believe in, even when it seems impossible. Eleanor, watching the couple from the doorway, smiled with satisfaction. You know, she commented, when I planned that first impromptu wedding— Wait, Lila interrupted, surprised. You planned it? The Callahan matriarch laughed softly. Let's just say I had a strong feeling about you two for a long time. Sometimes the right people just need a little nudge from fate, or a perceptive grandmother. So you knew Madison would run away? Sawyer asked, incredulous. Not exactly, Eleanor admitted. But I knew her heart well enough to know that she wasn't the right person for you. And I knew Lila well enough to see that she was. The sound of the rain against the library windows created an intimate atmosphere as the three shared laughter and memories. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had turned into a love story that defied convention and transformed lives. For the future, Eleanor raised her glass. And for all the stories not yet written. Lila and Sawyer exchanged a complicit glance, knowing that their journey was far from over. Bennett and books continued to grow, now a symbol of how literature could unite people and transform communities. Callahan Enterprises was redefining business success from a new, more human perspective. Do you know what I love most about our story? Lila asked Sawyer softly later that evening. That each chapter has brought us closer to who we really are. And the best thing of all, he replied, kissing her tenderly, is that we still have many blank pages ahead of us. In the silent library, among volumes that held thousands of love stories, Lila and Sawyer had written their own narrative. One that proved that sometimes the happiest endings begin with the most unlikely moments, and that true love has the power to transform not just hearts, but entire worlds.